You can have it, but do you have those any of those little 12-volt tiny Milwaukee batteries?
Yeah, they fit in my heated jacket.
Yeah, because that's why I haven't used them in a while, because my batteries are all shot. So you can.
Oh my God! So I could connect it to my heated jacket and have it come out of my arm like Iron Man. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is senior editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by video director Colin Russell.
Hey there.
Rob Wadsack, digital brand manager.
Hey guys.
And producer Jeff Rose.
Howdy.
Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Gentlemen, it is great to see you this morning. Thank you so much for being here.
No problem, Patrick, but you got to stop getting me up so early.
I know. I love this part to get you out of bed.
Yeah, this is the earliest one so far for me.
So we do this a little earlier because it seems to make the transmission work better. At least that's my excuse. So, Rob, I want to start with you. You have what might be your most interesting project to date, and it's not the funicular we talked about last time, but you are doing a lawnmower. Can you tell me about that?
Well, what I'm doing is, anybody who's watched some of the earlier episodes of the podcast probably caught my conversations about the bicycle plow that I built last year.
And it made you an internet star.
Yeah, I think it's probably about over 40 million views on Facebook alone of the video of this thing in action. And honestly, I'm on the second version of the bike plow now, and it's basically a pile of bike parts and signposts and a hand truck and some tractor weights and a plow from a garden tractor. And it's this kind of Frankenstein machine that I had been dreaming up for years and years, and finally built a version of it a couple of years ago, and then built the second version last year. And the second version, while not the most comfortable or efficient machine, is actually pretty functional. And I've used it in every snowstorm since I've built it. And people are like, "Oh, that won't work." I'm like, "We're here in New England. I get 6 inches of wet snow on the driveway. I can push right through it." Obviously with bigger storms, I have to go out more often, but it works. But I wanted something a little more comfortable, a little more robust, and a little bit more multi-purpose. And I figured a lot of the old garden tractors from like the early 80s and earlier would have horizontal shaft motors, which would work perfectly with the transmission to hook up a bicycle chain to the transmission. And so I searched and searched for a year, and I finally found this thing. It's a National Triplex 84 garden tractor. Actually, it's a commercial tractor for probably mowing golf courses. And all I have is the chassis. The mowers are gone, the motor's gone, which is perfect. There's less stuff for me to deal with.
So tell folks, so this is a thing that was originally set up that had a number of real mowers on it, right? And it was meant to cut greens, putting greens, probably to 3/8 of an inch or what have you. And it has steering on the front, correct?
Yeah, so it looks like a typical garden tractor chassis that's been stretched and widened by like 50% in each direction. And there's this big open space on the front. The seat and the steering column are pretty close to the back. I'm going to have to move the steering column to make room for the pedals. And so that's the only major fabrication I think I'll need to do on this job. But I've got some pictures of the chassis stripped down and the pedals mocked up, and I'll send those to you so we can share them with everybody here. But hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I'll have this at least as a rolling tractor, and I won't worry about attaching the plow until later on in the season. But what I do want to put is a small dump body on the front of it, because the chassis is so long, there's plenty of room for sort of like a wheelbarrow. If anybody out there is familiar with doodle bugs, which were like the old tractors made out of like Model A Fords, a lot of times they would only have one seat on them, and next to them they would have a wheelbarrow that the person driving could just lift the lever and dump off the back like a tiny dump truck. And that's sort of what I'm going to have on the front of this thing.
Sounds practical.
Yeah, and maybe even a rack on it for moving plywood, because I got a skinny gate, and to get sheet goods to my barn is a pain in the butt. So I don't know. We'll see.
I can't wait to see this thing unfold, dude. You're a mad genius.
So, Rob, do you have like massive thighs or something? How do you like
No,
propel all
so
this?
that's the crazy thing that everybody's always like, oh, how could you ever move snow with a tractor? Well, it's the thing is, you think about this. When you're riding a bicycle, you're going 15, 20 miles an hour, right? When you're riding a garden tractor, you can go, especially if you have a tiny yard like mine, you're not in any hurry. So you just gear the thing down really low. If you've ever driven a mountain bike with granny gears, you can climb the steepest hill you want if you put it in the lowest gear. And the same is true for the for a pedal powered machine. Like if I were mowing a half acre, I wouldn't be using this thing, or plowing a long driveway, I wouldn't. But for 100-foot long driveway, I'll take my time if it's going to save my back from shoveling. So
Interesting.
You need one, Colin.
Yeah, well, I'll have to see how this one comes out. Maybe we can start special ordering them.
You've actually had inquiries, right, Rob, of people who want to buy the bike plow, right?
Yeah, and everybody says, "Oh, how come you're not like making these things for a living?" And it's like, you know what? I'm not a business person, and I don't want to be a factory worker. I just like tinkering and figuring out how to make things that I haven't made before. So,
Colin, you've been busy too, right? You told me that you were fixing some stuff that you should have long ago, probably.
Yeah, well, 15 years ago, I built a small cabin for my family and I in Vermont. And this was long before I joined Fine Homebuilding. And I got to say, 2 weeks into the job, so going back 7 years now, I started thinking about, as I was learning about air sealing and water management, I started regretting just about every nail I put in my cabin. But in truth, I didn't do so bad. But I did not flash my doors. So there are overhangs, and the doors are kind of tucked underneath them. So the problem didn't evidence itself for quite a while. But for the last 2-3 years, I noticed the trim starting to go down along the base, right?
On the exterior?
On the exterior.
Uh-huh.
And then I noticed the jambs starting to go in the same area. And I was like, wow, I really got to do something about this. And, it's a 3-season cabin. I don't go up that often. But this year, the house smelled like mold. It didn't have a good odor. And it wasn't so much rot, but on the inside of the house, there was actually, I thought was rot, but you could wipe it up. And I'm like, okay, this has to be dealt with now. So I tore out the doors, and sure enough, water had been getting down into the sill and migrating into the floor joists and all of that. And I had quite a bit of water damage. And I did find one ant nest that was very disturbing.
Mm-hmm. So did you have to replace floor framing and sheathing, or had you caught it in time?
No, I had to rip out some sheathing, which it wasn't hard. Luckily, I used OSB, so it just fell out.
Pulls right up.
I pulled the siding off along the base there. I went about 10 feet in each direction, pulled back, going up about 18 inches, and then pulled back the WRB, which was Tyvek, and it was very clear where the water went, so I used a level to just square it all off and set the depth on my circular saw and made a 1/2-inch depth cut and just cleared out the area. And what's the plate that goes against your floor joist? The rim board? Yeah, so I had to replace the rim joist. And just to make sure that when I replaced it, it had good penetration into the floor joist, I sistered on little scabbed in little pieces. Even though the floor joists were fine, they were damp on the ends.
Mm-hmm.
So I dried it in, closed it up, and then used all my flashing techniques I've learned from Mike Girton.
Yep. And tape, right?
A lot of tape, stretch tape. The sill pan was key here, right? Having a sill pan and then flashed in properly. And then even went so far as to, the doors came pre-trimmed. I took that off and flashed over the jambs and then trimmed. So,
and did you put a aluminum drip cap on top of the brick mold at the top of the door?
I didn't, because the top of the door is really tucked away under the soffits, and they were perfect, just as, like as the day I put them in.
Yep.
So normally I would have, yes.
What would you tell someone about who's installing doors?
Read the magazine. Another thing I did, I guess, when I framed the place, looking at the rough opening dimensions, I'm like, you don't need all that space around a door. So I have like maybe a 1/4 inch around the entire opening to get the door frame in. So it was pretty snug.
Would you make the opening bigger again?
I would. I'd go by what the manufacturers recommend, and that also leaves you room to
shim it
and foam from the inside.
And a lot of builders now are suggesting going even bigger than they recommend by the manufacturer, because really the manufacturer is kind of a minimum. It's just to minimize the amount of shimming you have to do. But if you go bigger, it makes it a whole lot easier to do the air sealing later on.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think those openings are too big that they give you. I go smaller too. I mean, it's a pain to shim like a huge gap. Like you get these stacks of shims and, they don't stay in the right position. I don't know, man.
Yeah, well, I think to Rob's point, though, you could start with a 1/2 inch piece of plywood or a 1/4 inch piece of plywood before you even start shimming, right?
Yeah, sure.
Like choose your shim points. But on like a flanged window, for example, you don't want to do that because what are you nailing to, right?
Right, you're nailing into air.
Right. So I wish they would push the flanges out farther on windows, and then we wouldn't even have to. Flashing probably wouldn't even be as critical.
So how wide would you make it if you were the window king, man?
How wide?
Yeah.
3 to 4 feet.
Gives you a lot of room.
I'll tell you, just a 1/2 inch bigger would be huge.
Yeah,
right?
I agree there. So what'd you do this weekend, Jeff?
A lot of little stuff again. Nothing very exciting. I mean, smoked a brisket, baked some beans, made some masks.
That's not what I was going to think you were going to say when you said you were smoking, but I get it.
I've never smoked brisket. It seems like it makes me cough really bad.
So
Rob's at a hobo today, right?
Yeah, I'm jumping on the boxcar right now.
I love that noise, dude.
It comes by like 3 times a day.
Rob actually lives in a different century where they pedal their own snow plows and.
So before we go on, I want to point out something that Colin sort of glossed over before about how finding the ant nest, and this came up last night too. I was on the BS and Beer Kansas City. They had a blower door 101 class, and you know what? The funny thing to me that comes up a lot is that insects are often good tools for finding problems. If you are in your house, if you're sitting in your sunroom in your house like I was one day, and all of a sudden you see carpenter ants marching across the floor, you should probably try to see where they're coming from, because they don't eat dry wood. They only eat wet wood or chew on it, whatever they do to it.
You should qualify this, Rob. This in New England and the northern half of the country, this is true, right? If you live in the deep South, termites and ants eat everything because the conditions are always hospitable, right?
Yeah. So just don't build on the ground down there.
So have you diagnosed where your ants are coming from in your sunroom?
Oh, this was a while back. But basically there was no gutter above the sunroom, and it had just so much water volume from the upper roof had been falling onto that roof for years. One day I actually heard what sounded like people were eating Frosted Flakes, and it turned out that I've got this panelized sunroom kit that was built in the 70s or 80s, and it has that crunchy urea formaldehyde foam in the walls, and the ants love to nest in that stuff. And so if I did not hear those ants in there, I would not have known that half the sheathing on the sunroom on the roof was rotted away.
I'm amazed you could hear them. That sounds like a real infestation.
Well, you know what it is it's because it's panelized. The foam is right up against the drywall, so it's sort of like an amplifier.
Wow.
What was the sound?
Were
they talking?
Yeah, you're whispering in my ear.
I got nothing to report, relatively speaking. I did battle with the mugwort that has sprouted up since we lost all our oak trees, which previously had shaded this invasive species so it didn't grow. But now it gets to be like 6 feet tall every year. And I just decided to first mow it down with a hedge trimmer, and then I took the tractor over it, and boy, was that satisfying. And I only hit a piece of asphalt that was on the ground once. That was good. I'll put pictures of that up on the a podcast page because, you know, of all the projects I've done in recent memory, that's one I might be most proud of. Woo! So we got some feedback recently. This one comes from Canada. I know Canada's a big place, but this comes from Nelson. He says, one interesting tidbit. I'm not sure about the States. This is in relation to our conversation about affordable housing. There was a collection of free modest house plans available after World War II that a lot of people used to build their own houses, especially in neighborhoods like my own. It might be nice to see a modern version of that resource as maybe something similar you might be able to get going in the U.S. Wouldn't that be awesome if the government gave us free house plans for efficient, affordable housing? Yeah, why don't we do that? He says, the first time I wrote to you guys was about a leaky window. You more or less gave me the advice I wanted to hear. Fix the leak, but if you're not sure there is a further problem, maybe you don't need to tear it all apart. As I proceeded soon after the window incident to tear out the kitchen and redo both that and the main bathroom, a project that occupied much of the winter, I was happy to leave the upstairs wall intact. Until this spring. This spring, we discovered a few carpenter ants in the house, and I noticed them coming in and out of a small gap in the window casing by my troublesome window. So I tore apart the entire wall. The damage was worse than I had hoped. I discovered and vacuumed out a small nest of ants, dug out the worst of the rot, and had an exterminator in to spray and bait the area. My problem now is how to repair the wall. As you can see from the photos, the sheathing was completely rotted away to about 18 inches below the window, leaving an area of stucco at this point is freestanding. Clearly tearing it all out was the right move in the end. However, despite all the terrible things I've learned about stucco, I have no plans to remove or replace it, at least not in the near future. How do I close this back up? The wood repair, which I will do next more of, seems straightforward, but I really don't want insulation directly next to the exposed stucco without a WRB layer. Can I apply blue skin to the back of the stucco and have it work backwards, putting the sticky side on the interior of the stucco? Maybe I could monkey in a small piece of Tyvek or something. Spray foam? I appreciate your thoughts on this ongoing saga. So I love this question because it talks about bugs, rot, and problems with stucco. This is like the trifecta of problems.
Oh my gosh.
So did you see these photos, guys?
Yeah, that's
It's a mess.
Yeah, if you look from the inside, you see some not so horrible framing with a little bit of punky areas, but to see like a giant hole, I mean, it almost looks like someone shot a mortar through that wall and then just covered it up with stucco in the outside.
So in the conversations I've had with people who do stucco inspections, this is always what you see. Under windows is rot, and it's almost always the case. If it's plywood or board sheathing, the guys tell me that it's limited to about a basketball-sized hole. If it's OSB, it often goes all the way to the mud sill. So this guy had board sheathing, so he's pretty lucky in the fact that the rot didn't go as far as it could have. What do we do, though? What do we tell him? Can you fix this from the inside?
I don't know. I mean, me being the tinkerer I am, I'm like, well, is there some way you can put sort of a fibrous layer on there to and then some adhesive to back up to the or some mortar to back up to the stucco to support it? And then you talk about like how we've said if you have old board sheathing and you're remodeling insulating from the inside, you could do tar paper stapled into the stud bays to protect the insulation. But then again, and we had a similar question once, but then you're not protecting the outside edge of the framing at all. So, I mean, there's, again, the temptation is to not go farther than you have to, but you don't really know when it's far enough.
Stop.
Yeah.
I have a question about it. If he does this repair from the inside, isn't he going to end up in the same place 10 years from now? I mean, don't you need to access this window from the outside and like flash it in somehow to avoid this?
I think you would know better than anybody, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the thing is it's the fact that the window flashing wasn't done properly is what really has caused that rot underneath the window. So
the other problem with stucco is it's a reservoir cladding, as they say, right? It gets soaking wet and then it gets heated by the sun, and the sun drives that water as a vapor in toward the building, right? So I mean, you need something to slow that moisture movement, and felt paper would be the absolute minimum. I think the right approach is to rip this all off and redo the wall, but I understand his reluctance to do that. It's a huge job, and you need a pro to do stucco work, or Matt Milham.
And you mentioned reservoir cladding. I mean, that's the one thing that I feel like every time we have this conversation, so that everyone understands, is that when you have reservoir cladding, on a rainy day, it acts like a sponge, and on a sunny day, it just drives that moisture right inside towards the wall. So if you do not have if you have any moisture sensitive materials behind that, you're going to have problems.
And because it's behind the stucco or brick or stone or whatever, it doesn't dry readily, right? It doesn't get any airflow. It doesn't, it can't dry.
Yeah. It's trouble with
I don't know what to say,
houses.
Nelson. I don't know what to say, Nelson. I think, at a minimum, you got to get some asphalt felt paper. I like that because it dries when it can and takes on moisture when it can't. So I think the better option is to rip that stucco off and fix it. But are you going to do the whole house? Obviously the south facing and western facing walls are the worst problem in these situations. So I don't know what to tell you, man. Anyway, so let's move on. So here's another letter. Can you devote more time to building codes in your podcast? I've never thought I would hear anyone ask for that. Also, can you bring in more content from other countries, say like Sweden, where they have been building super tight panelized houses for many years now? The U.S. is not the only place in the world. I'm much too old to drop what I'm doing to get into the trade, so I'm trying to get involved from a regulatory standpoint. Our village, Oak Park, Illinois, just updated its codes to 2015 and is reviewing the 2018 IGCC. Do you guys know what this is? I had to look it up.
No.
Don't know.
International Green Construction Code.
Hey, before we move on, you know what Oak Park is notable for?
A lot of Frank Lloyd Wright houses, right?
One of the highest concentrations, yeah.
I think I visited the Roby house there. Our village just updated its codes to the 2015 and is reviewing the 2018 IGCC. All great, right? We have recently outsourced inspections to HR Green, and it's clear from at least one member of our panel that many in the industry don't feel this is necessary. This is a long and very complicated topic. I don't envy the head of the building department. He gets to tell people that they will have to wait for their new kitchen and that their kids won't be able to sleep in their beds for a while. Oak Park is fairly wealthy and it's close to downtown Chicago, so its older housing stock is very attractive to the sort of people who would work in Chicago. In other words, there are many opportunities to not just bring homes up to code, but to boost their performance. This should be done without question, but how do we get there? Someone bidding a job doing the right things will inevitably be underbid by someone who is not so interested in high-performance building, but just wants to get the job. To complicate things, we now have COVID, and telling homeowners and GCs that there are more things to do isn't going to play with those who are bringing money into the community. It is very hard to manage this without being the bad guy. COVID is blowing a $6 billion hole in the state budget, and Oak Park will have its own budget shortfalls. Getting to where we want to be will be much harder in the near term. It seems New England is getting things more right than Illinois, but why not look elsewhere? Who is doing this right? Who at a local, you pick the state, county, municipal level is getting this right? I know education is part of it, and that is what I would like to pursue. The other part is to remove the contentiousness between the code departments and the GCs. We are never going to bring our old buildings, and that's most of them, up to code, and let alone high performance through punishment. Budgets are getting cut and enforcement efforts are going down. In short, how do we combine the code and education to get our buildings up to snuff? Even these older buildings can be experience significant energy savings and increased comfort. Who is doing this successfully, and how did they get there? Good question, right?
I think this question, obviously this is a very specific answer he's looking for, and it's a big concern in old communities. I honestly think we should put out a plea to anybody listening right now. I know there are some parts of the country that are a lot more progressive with this stuff than others, probably parts of the Northwest or California, or just different pockets of different cities around the country. So if anybody out there has experience with this, we would love to hear from you. If you want to email in to fhpodcast@taunton.com. Did I get the email?
It's a great right? fhbpodcast@taunton.com?
Yeah.
No, yeah. That's a great question, John. We're going to ask our listeners to weigh in on that. I think one of the places we should look to is Canada. Our neighbors to the north have an unforgiving climate, and they've been studying this a long time, since the 50s and 60s, I'd say. And they seem to do a pretty good job. So those of you out there who have any thoughts on this, please let us know. This next question comes from Brian. Hello, FHB Podcast. Love the show. It's my favorite listen during home improvement projects. Do you have any tips, techniques, or best practices for drilling accurate holes in concrete for anchor bolts? My last project, I found that blind luck, swearing, and repeated trips to the hardware store for new bits to be the most successful method. I'm hoping there's an easier way, as I anticipate a need in the future to drill repeated holes in a concrete slab for wedge anchors. For my just completed project of attaching post brackets to an existing driveway, I used a hammer drill with appropriate bits, a lot of appropriate bits. They didn't seem to be effective for very long. I'm not sure if it was me, the quality of the bits, or the method, or it could be that I just didn't swear enough. During all the time I spent watching a hammer drill slowly chew through the driveway concrete, I came to the conclusion that I may be using the wrong tool. Should I bite the bullet and get an actual rotary hammer? Do I need to up my cursing game? I would say do that anyway. Future project will be a 30 by 40 shop with open web trusses. The columns will be individually anchored to the slab. And there's about 12 to 14 columns, each with 4 bolts. I can't imagine drilling over 50 holes with my current method, so I'm hoping there's a better way to do this. Any idea would be appreciated. So I think Brian has the right idea here. He needs a rotary hammer, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
When he said hammer drill, that's what I was picturing he was using. And then when you said, oh, maybe I should get a bigger one, I'm like, no, yeah, definitely. You got to have the right tool for that job. I killed a pretty beefy 1/2-inch hammer drill trying to do a small deck ledger project one time. And if you don't own one and you're not going to use it that often, you can rent them too from the tool places.
What are you going to say, Colin?
Well, I would say spend the money on the bit for sure. Get a really, really excellent bit. But anecdotally, when he's talking about drilling accurate holes, I talked to a friend of mine up in Vermont. A bunch of ironworker friends of mine helped me build a 1,500 square foot deck. And the deck ledger, it wrapped the house, obviously, and the ledger was let into or attached to the concrete foundation. So between lasers and chalk lines, I snapped the line where I wanted the ledger to go, and then the iron workers went at it. And I came back the next day, actually in the evening, with my laser level, and those did not drift more than 1/8 of an inch out of like 80 feet of ledger. It was so accurate. So I gave them a call yesterday and said, what did you do to get those so accurate? And what they did was they held the ledgers in place and drilled through them so that the ledgers were a guide. So if he wants accurate holes, I think coming up with some kind of guide jig is probably going to be the key to not getting tired, knowing you're drilling where you're supposed to be drilling. And so that's the lesson I took from it.
Oh, that's a great suggestion, man. You know, there's a lot of confusion between hammer drills and rotary hammers. So in a nutshell, a hammer drill uses gears to make a percussive action to drill holes in concrete and masonry. And honestly, if you're going bigger than about 1/4 of an inch, you need a bigger tool. A rotary hammer actually has a pneumatic piston in it that's beating on the bit from the back end, right? And it's beating and turning. And if you're doing holes of any number or any size, you really need a rotary hammer. And further adding to the confusion is even the home center gets this wrong at the rental counter. So I went looking at Home Depot yesterday to see what they had in reference to Rob's observation is that you can rent these tools. So they call a rotary hammer a hammer drill, but they're not the same thing. And so I looked up on Makita's website, and it is indeed a rotary hammer. So, you know, you need a rotary hammer, and you're going to be amazed at how often you use this tool. I love mine, right? I love it.
I've borrowed your tool before.
And it's awesome, right?
Oh, yeah. You have the Bosch, don't you?
Yeah. I have a Bosch Bulldog. And I checked on the interweb yesterday, and you can buy a reconditioned model for $150. And I always buy reconditioned tools when I can because you get the same warranty, and they usually cost 1/3 or 1/2 of what, you know, the unreconditioned version costs. If you don't want to spend that much money, you can buy a Harbor Freight version for $85. And if anybody out there has one of these, I would love to hear your experience with it because the price is certainly attractive. And you can rent one of these at Home Depot for 4 hours for $29 or $41 per day. If you need it for a week, it's $164. So I would say buy it if you need it for more than a week.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
You know, think about it this way: if even though the drills sort of do the same kind of thing, try to hammer a framing nail in with a tack hammer. You could wail on that thing all day long. If you just don't have the mass or behind it, you're never going to get the job done. And that's true for drilling in concrete.
The way these things are sized, so when it says 11/16 or a 3/4 inch rotary hammer, that means that's the size it is meant to drill consistently. You can go bigger on occasion, but if you go bigger than its designed size, you're going to wear it out prematurely. The next size up is probably 1 9/16 or 2 inches, and that's a much bigger tool, and it's heavy. So, you know, these things are made for drilling in concrete. That's what you need, you know. Save the hammer drill for making tiny holes in masonry for tapcons and that kind of stuff, or nylon anchors. And I think Colin's suggestion for getting precise holes is to use some kind of template, right, Colin? And so you're assured that the holes are in the right spot.
Yeah, I mean, just winging a jig off the top of my head, if you cut like perhaps a 2x12 down to 3 feet so you could stand on either end,
yeah.
and you know, you drill the holes you need where you need them in it, and here's your guide, and you just stand on the thing, and it'll tell your bit where to go.
Great suggestion. All right, so our next question comes from Ryan, who's in Redondo Beach, California. Hi, FHB gang. I'm in the process of redoing our living room. It was a nasty, awkward marble arrangement beforehand, as you can see in the photo. I'm sorry, I'm redoing our living room fireplace. It was a nasty, awkward marble arrangement, as you can see in the photo. I've stripped everything out and put up 2 layers of 1/2-inch cement board, and I want to cover the metal face that's behind the grill at the top of the firebox below. But my dilemma is the crown molding. I plan to cover the cement board in something resembling stacked stone and would like the crown to extend out around the stone, which goes up to the ceiling. My question is, how do I cut the existing crown to begin this process? I was thinking of running a straight edge up to this on the cement board and marking where it hits the crown bottom, then starting my beveled/angled cut from there to create the inside corner. How in the world do I do that? Do I create a jig with the miter saw for the compound cut? Or is there a guide to hand cut the existing crown? Or should I just take the crown off back to the closest corner and install a brand new piece? Would love to hear your thoughts. So he wants to leave the crown molding and then run the stone up to it. Can he do that?
You know, scribing something that's got a interesting profile like that to some rough stone, I mean, even if you could do it, it's going to make a weird edge on it. I mean, if anything, what I would do would pull the crown off, put a square, backer piece on there, scribe that to the stone, and then wrap the crown around that.
That's the way to go.
Yeah. And what I've seen people do this in new home construction is it's really fussy, and frankly, I don't think it looks good to describe moldings to stone or brick. To me, it looks wacky. It should slip behind the masonry or figure out some kind of transition that you don't have this scribe. I mean, like carpenters love to show off these scribes to rough cut masonry, but I think it looks wacky.
You know what I might even do in a situation like this, if he really wants to run the stone all the way to the ceiling, if he hasn't done this yet, it looks like, or has he?
No, he hasn't done.
Buy some pieces of cut stone that are in a similar color to the stone that he's working with, and use that as sort of as the top sort of freeze board that the crown that could then wrap around. So then you're actually you're not cutting a molding to a weird shape. You actually have the stone conforming to the stone.
That's a really good idea.
What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I don't see how to do it any other way, with it in place. I don't think it's going to make any sense.
I agree. I like when we have consensus.
Oh, come on. It's more interesting when you shoot down our ideas, Patrick.
Our next question comes from Vern. Hey, all. I have some questions on my roof at my rental duplex that I was wondering about, and you might all have some input on and would like to hear you discuss it. The unit has a low-slope roof with no ridge vent. And is that an issue on LowSlope? There is venting at the eaves. I've read several conflicting things on the need for ridge and soffit vents. On the unit, the lip of the roofing at the drip edge is curling up. Do you think I need to cut the roofing way back and redo it? What about some type of strapping / fasteners to pull it back down and then seal the fasteners? I live on the east side of Washington, where it was hot and dry in the summer and cold and dry in the winter, and power is cheap, so I don't really want to redo the roof and add more insulation. It only has about R15, but my average power bill in my 1960s Rambler with a daylight basement is about $50. Last month it was $28. Boy, that is low electric rates, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Have you guys seen the photos of this?
Yeah. So
he's got to rip this roof off, right? Like, how do you fix that?
See, basically the plywood is probably warped
or delaminating, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is another one of those scenarios where you just don't know what's really going on underneath there.
I know what's going on under there. It's rotting.
Right, but replacing the roof only solves replacing the roof. It's going to rot again. So it sounds like he does have a ventilation issue.
Or not enough slope. This sucker is almost flat, right?
Yeah, I mean, flat roofs are challenging to make last forever, and especially over conditioned space. But it's really hard to know whether he has just some warped plywood. But I mean, whether he's got warped or rotted plywood or damaged rafters, it's basically because there's moisture getting in there. So
I think that's got to come off, and at a minimum, it's the first row of, I don't know, what is that, roll roofing or rubber? I don't know what it is, but I think that's got to come off. I think a better solution is he doesn't want to do this, but you got to outsulate, and commercial buildings often have rigid insulation that is sloped, and I think that would be a great solution here. Is you get pre-sloped polyiso board and then put a membrane on top of that, and it solves your problem, and you're going to have the added benefit of better thermal performance. But it's not going to be inexpensive. It's going to cost thousands, my guess.
Yeah, I guess the tough thing is, though, it looks like he's got some siding that comes pretty close down to that roof there. So if he starts doing exterior insulation, he's going to probably have to mess with the bottom edge of that siding too.
Yeah, he's going to have to move it up, cut some of that up and finish it off.
But yeah, that exterior insulation, I mean, like you said, flat roofs, commercial roofs, that's the way. In fact, the recycled insulation that you used on your barn probably came from a situation like that, right?
So mine was all uniform thickness. So they're made both ways. You either build the slope into the roof structure, right, or you build the slope into the insulation layer. So mine came off a roof that was apparently sloped on the framing side. Do you guys see any way to fix this without tearing this apart?
I mean, at a minimum, you'd need to open up that area where it's warping or sagging and then redo the whole roof surface, if not redo, something more than that.
But again, don't you have to like mitigate this moisture getting up there? And like, are there canned lights under that area of the house? Like, is there something you could do on the inside to help make it last? Like, get rid of the canned lights or add more insulation or an air barrier of some sort.
So you're thinking the moisture is coming from the interior, not a leak?
Well, I haven't seen the pictures, so.
Thank you for being so well prepared.
I can't access the server.
I'm pretty sure that it's leaking, right? Because the water's just sitting on there and ponding, but it could be from the inside.
Okay, if it's, then yeah, you just replace it, and you got to manage the water, man. You got to get it to go away.
Get the water to go away. That's Colin's advice.
Yeah, I mean, at a bare minimum, you got to open up that section that you got to plan that you're going to have to redo some roofing, and you got to at least open up the section where that ponding is happening on the roof.
And you can tell there's ponding because the membrane is all black from the water sitting there, and it's either dirt, and it's molding, or it's just dirt from pollution, right?
Yeah, because his statement was that, can I pull the edge of the roof down to prevent that from curling up? But is it really curling up, or is it sagging? That it's a little hard to tell from the angle of the picture. But one way or another, it's either damaged sheathing or sagging sheathing, and that section of the roof should really come up. And then once you open it up, then you can kind of investigate to see where the moisture was potentially coming from, and whether or not you need to deal with air sealing or just do a better job of putting a roof back on it.
Vern, I might be tempted to go from the soffit side, pull down a piece of soffit material and have a look up there from the underside. And I think when you do that, you're going to see that the sheathing is delaminating or rotting, and that's going to be your problem. But maybe you do some exploration from the underside. And it might be a chance to buy one of those cool borescopes you can get on Amazon for like $50 now, as you drill a 1/2-inch hole and you stick that up there and snoop around. Do you guys have one of those? I've always wanted one.
No, don't have one.
I actually do have one of those Milwaukee ones. And
I need to borrow that, Rob.
Yeah.
And I'm not giving it back.
You can have it. You can have it. But do you have those any of those little 12-volt tiny Milwaukee batteries?
Yeah, they fit in my heated jacket.
Yeah, because that's why I haven't used it in a while, because my batteries are all shot. So you can.
Oh my God! So I could connect it to my heated jacket and have it come out of my arm like Iron Man.
Yeah.
All right, so we're doing something new today. All right, you guys ready? This is our lightning round. So some people complain that the show gets boring. I don't know what's wrong with those people. But here we go. We're going to have a bunch of questions.
Because we don't talk about the code enough.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. These questions come from our social media accounts. So you all who are into our Fine Homebuilding social media, take heart that we do look at that stuff, and your question might get answered on the podcast. So here we go. Woo! What is the best way to build a steam shower with marble walls? Do I need to worry about moisture getting behind the marble and not being able to escape? Yes. You can't have any water or any vapor getting into the assembly, right? You need to have a completely vapor-tight assembly. It's hard to build a steam shower. I would say go to Schluter and see their details, because their membranes are completely waterproof. Or you can use a surface-applied waterproofing layer, but you can't have any penetrations. Steam showers have high stakes. The steam gets into the framing and never gets out. And because there is such a huge vapor drive, it wants to go from more to less. So it's always going to move into your walls if it can get there. How about that?
That was a great answer, Patrick.
You going to take the next one, Rob?
Sure. What is it?
All right. I have a question. My exterior wall is going bad. Major water damage. I'm planning on getting plywood sheathing, house wrap, wire, and exterior plaster. Do you have any recommendations?
Oh my God. This is the speed round? Oh man.
Yes, do that.
Oh, exterior plaster?
Yeah, I think he's talking about stucco, right?
Stucco.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're the stucco expert. You should have been answering that one.
So I'm saying don't use stucco. I mean, there are certain parts of the country where that's an expectation, but God, it's really hard to get right. And your water management better be spot on. We've heard this again and again, right? Pay attention to your flashing details, Alejandro. Okay, this one comes from C Sayer 40. I have an obscure question for you. I'm an owner builder out of Tucson and building an unconventional steel build with steel studs. What are your thoughts on the use of spray foam insulation to insulate and create a moisture barrier to stop condensation from forming on the roof? What about this compared to other options like blanket fiberglass bats or foil-lined foam board? Go ahead, Colin.
Spray it. Spray it, forget about it. I don't even understand. So is the roof a metal structure?
I'm guessing he has corrugated metal or some kind of metal assembly that gets some kind of membrane roofing on top. But this is the lightning round, so we're just gonna take our assumptions and run with them. So how do you think it's built?
I think you need an air gap if you have a corrugated metal roof between whatever you do, right? So
or you need to insulate on the outside, right? So it's not a condensing surface, right?
There you go.
Yeah. Tucson, it's pretty hot and dry there. So the one problem you have in the Southwest is night sky radiation. So what they discovered when they started putting white membrane roofs on a housing development, and I think Joe Steebrook was part of this fiasco, they figured out that because surfaces that are light colored start radiate to the night sky and they become condensing surfaces on the underside. And this was revealed when moisture started raining down in this condo complex. And they first thought it was bulk water problems, but it actually turned out to be this condensation issue. So don't use white roofing materials in the desert Southwest. And make sure, like any other place where you use steel buildings, you can't create a condensing surface. The steel has got to be kept warm by either putting the insulation on the outside or you got to keep it wrapped in insulation. But what am I forgetting in this discussion, Rom?
Yeah, I would think an exterior insulation, but would be in a simple scenario. But then again, if he's doing a metal building, maybe it's going to be an all exposed metal building, and he doesn't want any of that stuff happening on the outside. It's hard to say from the question, but I wish we had a picture of this.
No one is going to ask a question on our social media accounts ever again. These people are no help whatsoever.
No, just tell them post a picture with your question.
So what do we think about Instagram and YouTube and Facebook for asking these kind of questions? Do you guys trust that you get good information when you pose a question on these? I see some comments on some other social media sites, and like the people who answer them probably shouldn't be answering.
Yeah, I mean that's the danger of those kind of environments is that people are shooting from the hip. It's like people do not hesitate to in many cases to just sort of say what they think is the best answer. I mean, I guess an exception to that, from my experience, would be to like go to the comments section on a website like Green Building Advisor, where the people that are there for specifically because they want to share the most detailed information on building science.
But, and those comments are vetted. Like when someone gets something wrong, the other participants are very vocal about setting, the record straight.
Yep. Yeah. There are other resources like that are pretty good too, like the Building Knowledge group on Facebook that I know you're a member of, right? Mm-hmm. And that's always a danger if you're in an environment like that where people are just answering questions on the fly. You just have to kind of look at the group as a whole, look at all the answers as a whole and see if there's some consistency in there. But really, I wouldn't say that's my best source for answering questions like that.
Colin, have you had any experience using, internet forums or social media to ask a question about something you were unfamiliar with?
Not that I've asked a question, but I've followed like other people's questions. And I think it depends who you're asking, because if you follow somebody like a Steve Basic, for example, you're going to a good source. So I think once you find a trusted source, you repeatedly go there. And that's Fine Homebuilding as well, right? That's what we do.
Yeah. Jeff, as an example, I bet you went looking recently to how to fix your tractor. Did you find that you got good information there?
Well, yeah, I wound up going to Husqvarna, so I got it from the manufacturer, but that was really only limited because I was asking the wrong questions. But
So Husqvarna has its own forum. Is it moderated by people from the company?
yeah. It wasn't a forum. It was just well, I guess it was a question and answer. Yeah, FAQ page. So
my experience with this has been all over the map. So you guys probably know I work on my own vehicles largely, right? I haven't taken my cars to the repair shop very many times. And recently, I think I told folks who listen to the podcast that I had to replace a brake hose. And I went looking for information on how tight to make what's described as the banjo bolt. This is a bolt that connects the brake hose to the caliper. And there are a pair of copper washers that actually make the seal. And if you make the connection too tight, you damage the washers and it leaks. And if you don't make it tight enough, it doesn't seal, right? So I went looking for information on how tight to make those. And the answers were all over the board. So you really got to make sure you're getting the right answer before you trust any of those sources, I would say. And us too.
Yeah, we don't know what we're talking about.
I'm shooting from the hip.
Yeah, going to any source, any crowdsourced information, it's like, if you're going in completely ignorant of how things work, it can be tough to vet the answers. If you've been doing something for a while and you're just looking for clarification, then you can have a better idea of what you're looking for and if the answer looks like what you're trying to get at. I mean, like talking about cars, I used to really be into Volkswagens, had a lot of Volkswagens. For some reason, the Volkswagen community is very into sharing information. You'll go and find on forums detailed how-to demonstrations of even doing modifications to vehicles, where when I had my Honda Element, there was a Honda Element Owners Club, and it was mostly a bunch of posts where there were just people saying, well, I think you could do this and maybe this, and like you could tell that none of them understood anything about how their car worked. They were just doing the best they could. So it's tough. I mean, obviously the internet is a great source of information, but you just have to be careful.
Agreed. I got information, answers ranging from like 100 foot-pounds to 15 to tighten this banjo bolt. And the correct answer is 21 foot-pounds. So, I mean, if you tighten that to 100 foot-pounds, you destroy it, right? So got to pay attention to where your info is coming from.
So,
and don't listen to us.
To that point, the first place I would look in a situation like that is search for PDFs of shop manuals online. And the analogy in the building industry is if you're working with certain products, go to the product manufacturer's websites and look for installation manuals. This is something Mike Gerton talks about all the time. It's like, that's one of the biggest things lacking in our industry is real documentation accessible to the average person for how to not just use individual materials, but how to build assemblies, how compatible different materials are with each other. Fortunately, I feel like that information is out there. Sometimes it just takes a little digging to find.
Mike's point I've heard him make is that to cover their butts, manufacturers are often ambiguous, or even they don't give you any direction on how to use their products because they don't want to be on the hook if there are failures later. And I think that's unconscionable. Like, how do you expect to get people using your stuff and be satisfied with it if you don't tell them how to.
Yep. And to that point, there's usually somebody at their company who understands how this stuff works, and the small time builder might not always be able to get access to those people, but it's worth a shot to try to call and get directly to the technical or engineering guys because I've heard stories of people looking at for the compatibility of materials in the instruction manuals, and then finally getting in touch with one of the engineering guys at the company. We're like, of course those things aren't compatible, but they didn't necessarily make that explicit in their documentation.
You guys should have seen the instructions that came with my Pella Pro line windows, right? It was a sticker on the window itself, and it was laughable how little detail. It didn't tell you how to flash the window. It didn't tell you what kind of sealant to use. It just showed a picture of the window, in situ on the opening, and it said like for brick, wood siding, shingles, and it just had all these. It's just like, this is not instructions. It was bad. Do you guys have anything to add?
Are you wearing your new podcast T-shirt today again, or no?
No, it's in the laundry, Rob.
Okay.
So we should tell people about that. We now have podcast and other Fine Home Building merchandise on the teespring.com website, and we'll put links to that on the podcast page. Rob, you also want to take mention of other podcasts that you think our listeners might be into. And you mentioned one by one of our regular contributors, right?
It's early in the morning still, Patrick. I can't remember which one you're talking about.
Katie Hutchinson's.
Yes. Where was that? You go on with something for a second. I'm going to look that up because that was a good thing, but I don't.
Oh, thanks. That's the only thing I had to talk about, dude.
Come on. You can ramble for a minute.
So Katie Hutchinson does a design column for Fine Home Building, or used to, and she's a very talented designer and a very smart lady, and she now has a podcast, and Rob's going to tell us what that's called because I don't remember. And if those of you who listen to our show might really enjoy the Fine Woodworking podcast too, called Shop Talk Live. It's our colleagues from the woodworking brand, and they have a very interesting conversation regularly. What is it, every 2 weeks, right, Rob?
Yep. So it's called Design Me a House. Katie Hutchinson and who else? She's partnering with somebody else on that. Let me just see here.
And I believe Mike Baines now has a podcast focusing on the Pretty Good House. And I haven't given that a listen to, but I definitely intend to because he's so enjoyable and so smart. What are you looking at?
Here, I found it. Okay, so architect Katie Hutchinson and textile designer Dawn Oliveira share insight into home design and design for the home. I haven't listened to a whole episode of this yet, but I did listen to one of the recent podcasts, and they've got a really nice vibe going. It's actually a really good listen, and it would probably be a nice complement to our sawdust and concrete topics on the FHB podcast.
So we'll put a link to her podcast on our podcast page for those of you listening, and we'll also put one for Mike Mains's new blog, and I forget who he's hosting that with, but tell us what you think. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks to Rob, Colin, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com, and please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Thanks again, everybody, and happy building.